Hi, welcome to my talk. It is titled Calladita te ves más bonita, Autism and Marianismo, Reclaiming Self-Care and Autistic Identity for Latina, Latinx, Latina, and AFAB individuals. So welcome to my plática, as we say in Spanish, or talk. I will explore the deep cultural expectations rooted in Marianismo, the idealization of self-sacrificing womanhood in Latinx cultures, and how it intersects with the lived experience of autistic women and AFAB individuals. Understanding the negative consequences promotes better insight of its influence on women's roles, drawing from neurodiversity. Affirming values, this talk, or plática, centers autistic culture, identity, and authentic self care rather than compliance based wellness or masking. So, calladita te ves más bonita translate to you look more beautiful when you keep quiet. And so that phrase captures what Marianismo is. Marianismo is ingrained in the Latinx culture and portrays ideal women as submissive, self sacrificing, and pure. Enduring pain and sorrow, even, is also viewed as a virtue. And this is viewed or influenced by a patriarchal culture that teaches that catering to men is love at the cost of neglecting your own needs. It's important to understand the influence they still have today, as it sheds light on the interconnected relationship between these two cultural constructs. So, machismo and Marianismo, they originate from the impact of colonization on Latin American men and the subsequent consequences this had on Latin American women. So, through Roman Catholic beliefs, the Spanish praised the Virgin Mary or La Virgen de Guadalupe as a model of what they believed to be a definition of a pure woman. This has indoctrinated women in that self sacrifice is a part of who they are, and this has been reinforced and transmitted intergenerationally. And so, colonization in Latin America had a traumatic impact. Machismo came out as a response to the violence and violation inflicted by colonizers. So, in an effort to protect their women and to cope with feelings of powerlessness and inferiority, indigenous men developed hypermasculine and ultimately harmful behaviors to form as a form of defense. So ultimately, machismo was seen as a survival mechanism for indigenous men to regain that sense of control after everything was taken away. So similarly, Latin America's independence from Spain reinforced patriarchy. As the rise of caudillo, or a coercive military leader, became the model of masculinity, establishing a patriarchal ideal for men in Latin American society. So this role was reinforced both by the government and religious institutions, further embedding this hypermasculinity with the Latin American homes. So understanding this history, it's important to recognizing its deep and profound impact on women in the region. And so it didn't only form our grandmothers or our abuelas' behaviors, it changed their genes epigenetically. These patterns are manifested in our bodies as anxiety, perfectionism, and the need to care for everyone and put ourselves aside. Essentially, colonization rewired our nervous systems, right? So, which is why family patterns are now so difficult to break. And trauma and these rules of silence, sacrifice, and service were used for survival during colonization, which have influenced every aspect of our lives. So women essentially were forced into mostly just fawning and freezing. And so I kind of want to talk about how our artistic traits and Marianismo intersect. Marianismo often demands emotional suppression, obedience, and self sacrifice, which directly clash with many of our autistic traits that require self advocacy, regulation, and honesty for well being. For autistic Latinas and AFAB individuals, these conflicting pressures can lead to masking, burnout, internalized shame, and even delayed diagnosis, or I should say identification. We don't want to pathologize. And so understanding this intersection is so crucial for culturally competent and neurodiversity affirming support. And so I made this chart so we could better see how this conflicts the artistic traits and the expectations of Marianismo. And so honest, clear, and direct communication that we have, and you know, it we seek explanations and clarifications, and we question ambiguity. Women are expected to be soft spoken and modest and agreeable, and to be indirect and avoid confrontation with Marianismo. And so this is seen as rude, disrespectful, talking back, being too much, and then it'll lead to shame, punishment, or silencing, social rejection within the family community. And then we have sensory differences and sensitivities, right? So we have over or under sensitivity to sound, light, touch, texture, smell, other sensory systems, and this usually causes distress or a need for accommodations. But then the Marianismo expectation, we're expected to endure discomfort silently and gracefully for the sake of others and to not complain. And so essentially, sensory needs are dismissed as being dramatic or spoiled, or how we say in Spanish, chiflada, and increases internalized distress and pain and discomfort. And so, in part of our sensory differences, some of us may be sensory seeking. Like, for example, we seek, some of us may seek input through movement, pressure, physical stimulation, and it'll be seen as hyperactivity, fidgeting, rocking, pacing back and forth. And but our expectations, we're expected to remain still, composed, and quiet, especially in public, church, and family spaces. And then this is judged as being inappropriate, undisciplined, and then we're mislabeled as immature or unladylike, and then we're discouraged from self-regulating. And then there's emotional or sensory overwhelm, to unexpected change as well, and that leads to shutdowns and really intense reactions like meltdowns. But then we're expected to remain emotionally composed, silent, and passive, even under pressure. And so this overwhelm is misread as overreacting, disobedience, attention seeking, or out of control. And it's often punished and shamed. And so it reinforces emotional suppression. And then we also experience co-occurring conditions, such as a lot of us, a high percentage of us are going to experience ADHD as well. It just comes with the package, other learning disabilities, chronic illness, GI issues. I came with that complete package. I have all those experiences. And it really affects our focus, our energy, our well being. But with Marianismo, we're expected to keep going without rest, to not complain, and to just continue to serve others. And so this leads to health struggles. And, our need for rest is affected, our need for flexibility. That all gets ignored and seen as laziness or weakness. And then we also have processing differences, this need for extra time because of it. And so we may take longer, right, to process like verbal instructions, information, changes, new environments. But we're expected to just anticipate needs, others' needs, and to multitask. That is a big one. I know I've experienced that myself, just being expected to multitask efficiently and then adapt very quickly in all these roles that we have without asking for help, with not needing any help. So then we're seen as slow or forgetful, unmotivated, irresponsible, and just creates so much stress and impacts our self-esteem. And a big one for Us neurodivergent folks, autistic and ADHD alike, we're monotropic individuals or processors. And this means that we have this ability to hyper focus, to have this really deep focused interest in just few things. And this makes it difficult to switch attention, right? Or this multitasking. So we're expected to have, I guess I'll say, monotropic split, to do the splitting. We're expected to balance so many roles like caregiving, faith, family duties, just so many things with emotional availability to others at all times. And so special interests may be criticized as selfish or obsessive because this, I guess, inability to multitask, or, I mean, we can, but it'll come with these consequences. It's very misunderstood. And then another autistic trait that a lot of us experience, I know I do, is PDA, or pathological demand avoidance, or also reframed as a pervasive desire for autonomy. High anxiety and resistance toward demands and expectations, even self imposed, especially when autonomy is threatened. That is what the experience of PDA is. But with these expectations, we're expected to be compliant, obedient, right? It's a current theme, self sacrificing without questioning authority. And so this is very hard because then we become, if we're really high PDAers like I am, experiencing, like, when we becoming resistance and we really need that autonomy, it's viewed as rebellion, labeled as defiant, as us being ungrateful, not ladylike. That's always common, and just it fosters so much guilt. And I think goes hand in hand with justice sensitivity. A lot of us experience this. And so we have strong emotional responses to unfairness, mistreatment, or hypocrisy. But we're expected to endure injustice, especially from authority, elders, men, quietly and respectfully. And we could be seen again as confrontational, rebellious, just being difficult, disrespectful, and will be discouraged from speaking up and even punished for questioning norms. And so self-advocacy and boundary setting, that's another one that's important. As autistic individuals, we usually work very hard just to name our needs and to try to set boundaries. And so, but we're expected to just say yes to everything and serve for others and just tolerate discomfort for the family's sake. And so this assertiveness can be, again, framed as being disrespectful, egoistic, especially towards male or elder figures. And so lastly, alexithymia and interoception. So this was a big one for me, something that I learned just a few years ago, and it made so many things like made sense. And so this is a difficulty identifying and understanding or expressing one's own emotions or even physical sensations. That's where interoception comes in. And so this leads to emotional confusion or numbness sometimes. And there's a misconception. People who are alexithymic are often viewed as unemotional, but we feel very intensely and can be hyper empathetic. But there's this unspoken demand for emotional labor that can be so exhausting and confusing and impossible to fulfill in ways that are recognized or appreciated. And so the struggles with emotional expression may be misunderstood as coldness, selfishness, or emotional immaturity. And of course, it's going to lead to guilt or shame for just not meeting these expectations of femininity. And it can be exhausting, confusing, impossible to fulfill in ways that are recognized, again, I repeated that, or appreciated. So it just adds another layer of internal conflict and reinforces the masking and emotional suppression. So that's a very common theme here. And so the psychological cost. Well, not all Latina households practice Marianismo, many Latinas still silently struggle with its strict expectations, such as self-sacrifice, sexual repression, and emotional silence. These patterns, though rooted in past generations, they continue to impact mental health today as generational trauma. So it is difficult to admit that Marianismo promotes this chronic self-denial, encouraging women to always put others' needs before their own. It also creates a culture of silence where women feel a need to suppress their voices and emotions and opinions, often at the expense of their well-being. So although Marianismo may be like a tradition of our grandparents or our parents' time, I continue to observe these effects in modern relationships, where it often emerges as a form of intergenerational trauma or generational trauma. These behaviors, while normalized and often unconsciously repeated, they can be challenged. So, as a therapist working with this community, I would offer some of these following reflections to help disrupt this cycle. So, recognizing and exploring these dynamics can help to begin to break the cycle and reclaim your voice. And so, one of the things that's important to recognize is autistic burnout, which is serious and a chronic state. And so, key characteristics of autistic burnout is chronic, pervasive exhaustion, which affects our mental, physical, and emotional well being, heightened sensory sensitivity or sensory overwhelm, a loss of functional skills like our executive functioning, self care, communication, just daily living skills. All of that comes at a cost. And then there's other symptoms like increased anxiety, meltdowns, and shutdowns, which, as I discussed, is going to be mistaken for like being dramatic, or panic attacks, ataques de pánico, how we say in Spanish, being chiflada, spoiled. But we're experiencing real symptoms of burnout. And then this leads to, once we're at that level, it makes it hard for us to mask. So then this leads to more visible stimming, more of our traits, right? Stimming, and more of that emotional dysregulation. There's an increase in depression and suicidality. And then there's, affects our work, our relationships, our parenting roles, which all of that then leads to guilt and shame for essentially like failing culture or neurotypical expectations. So additional stressors that contribute to burnout are going to be sensory overload, which increases under cultural and gender role expectations. And so then alexithymia and interoception challenges, they just add to the confusion and distress around emotion and bodily needs. Processing differences and executive function challenges, which can impact our planning and time management, our memory and communication. And our core co-occurring conditions, like, as I discussed, ADHD, chronic illnesses, hormonal shifts is a big one for us females, puberty, pregnancy, perimenopause symptoms, menopause. I know I've experienced mostly all of those. I'm in perimenopause. I'm experiencing those symptoms. And so all of this increases burnout or can contribute to it, these additional factors. And of course, gender and sexual identity conflicts. Queer autistic individuals face compounded cultural and familial rejection. And so then also one thing to think about is the trauma and vulnerability that autistic people experience. We are more prone to PTSD due to this, our heightened sensitivity and difficulty regulating post-stress. And so up to 60% of us will report trauma. Research says that. And so often from events neurotypical society wouldn't even label as traumatic. So things like sensory overload, as we discussed, social rejection, bullying, and validation. So within patriarchal systems, autistic women and AFAB individuals face increased risk of violence and assault, medical gaslighting even, especially when masking destroys our autonomy or silencing makes self-protection so difficult. And then we also experience a loss of identity and internalized ableism. And that's because Marianismo ties worth to service, self-denial, and acceptance by others. And this conflicts with the autistic need for authenticity and self-regulation. And so this results in, again, a loss of self-identity, decrease in self-love and self-worth. And as I discussed, that heightened vulnerability to exploitation and abuse, chronic identity confusion, and internalized ableism and cultural guilt. Unlike mainstream self-care, which can feel superficial or performative, autistic self-care is about radical authenticity, honoring sensory needs and reducing social pressure and reclaiming the right to exist without apology. So this means to reject internalized messages that equate love with self-erasure, and identify and name cultural narratives that push you to overmask, create personal and culturally rooted self-care plans that reflect true neurodivergent selves, not the version expected by others like family or religion, society even, reinterpreting Mary, the Virgin Mary, as strength, agency, solidarity with the oppressed, and actively participating in dismantling and challenging the traditional power structure and challenging traditional gender roles. So self-care is so vital for managing our unique challenges, because they are very unique, to be neurodivergent and to be a Latina, reducing burnout and fostering overall well-being. It involves prioritizing and supporting your physical, mental, and emotional health, which enhances the ability to navigate daily life with greater ease and confidence. So, asking for help, advocating for yourself and your needs, accommodating, not suppressing your needs, identifying needs, emotions, and mind body connection, they all require learning to put yourself first and letting go of shame, which is very difficult when it's really ingrained in us. And so, there are key aspects of self care for autistic individuals. There is emotional regulation. So, finding ways to regulate, self soothe that are calming, especially to your sensory systems, allowing yourself time and space to become engaged in your passions or your spins, your special interests, as they're also called, unmasking when it feels safe. Learning to unmask is so important, but I understand it's difficult. Destigmatizing stimming, and so also there's self-advocacy, so understanding your rights, standing up for what is best for you, and knowing what you deserve, that you deserve to have your needs met. Setting boundaries and seeking support from others when necessary, which is also hard. It's hard to ask for help, but this is very important for self-advocacy. And just understanding and addressing your sensory needs, understanding that it can help with coping with challenges more effectively, and building a support system that is super important for self-care, finding community, just finding comfortable ways to be part of the autistic or broader neurodivergent communities. It can provide a sense of solidarity and understanding. So finding people who can offer emotional support is very, very important. And of course, professional support and making sure that they're neurodiversity affirming, trauma informed, LGBTQ affirming, interoception based. All these are very key components for professional support. And just creating a personalized self-care toolkit. So, allowing yourself time and space to become, as I already discussed, immersed in your passions, in your special interests, caring for your body in a way that, for example, balances nutrition with emotional safety around any sensory issues or food preferences that you may have. And again, just finding ways to accommodate your sensory needs or sensitivities. Even just experimenting with fidgets and stimming tools. Um, there's calming apps and meditation guides if that's something that works for you. And just there's many other sensory friendly accessories like weighted blankets, weighted plushies. I know those have made a big difference for me. Noise canceling headphones, learning that I am noise sensitive to so many years of suppression led to me not knowing my needs. And so that was a discovery for myself. And so that was very helpful. So something I recommend. Um, and anything else like visual supports and routines, anything that helps you. And then another important part of autistic cultural self-care is neuroqueering, which Dr. Nick Walker describes as intentionally liberating oneself from the culturally ingrained and enforced performance of neuronormativity. I wanted to provide some reflective questions. And this, if you're not a person that likes to journal, not everybody likes to sit down and journal. Some people process that way by writing. These could be questions that you could discuss, with other people, other support systems, uh, with your therapist. Um, and so on cultural expectations and identity, something to reflect on is, when did I first learn that being good meant being quiet, selfless, or emotionally controlled? In what ways have I felt pressure to suppress or hide parts of myself to be accepted in my family or culture? How has Marianismo shaped how I show up in relationships, work, community, etc.? And on autism and masking, what aspects of my autistic self have I been taught to hide or tone down? What situations make me feel like I need to perform or mask the most? What has masking protected me from? But what has that also cost me? And lastly, on self care, liberation and reclamation. So, on reclaiming, make your rules in these areas: family, relationship, work, school, self care, and anything else you want to add to the list. A question you could ask is your inner self-talk influenced by the messages you were told by family, parents, culture? Sometimes it's helpful to, when you're going through your self-talk, ask yourself, whose voice is it? And what messages are we changing and letting go of? I know for me is a big one. Rest is not laziness. And there's a whole list of them that we could list, right? And so, what does authentic self care look and feel like for me? Not what I've been told it should be. What guilt or fear comes up when I try to set boundaries or prioritize my needs? And lastly, how can I begin to show myself the care, understanding, and compassion I often give to others? I hope you enjoyed my plática today. Thank you.